If there's positive reception for this roster, I'd like to do this again for 10 or so more honorable mentions who I thought would be great fits, but couldn't quite make it in because of the fighting style or regional diversity overlap. So, that went well. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Kyle. I've played League for over 7 years, and I grew up with fighting games. Project L is in the works, and it looks great, so I made a roster of 20 characters, plus the 5 champions already confirmed by Riot in a previous video. Project L is a tag fighter, so having a 25-character roster on release is feasible, if not a little hopeful. I'm still happy with my roster overall, but my heart shattered at the sacrifices that had to be made in order to get down to my target number. If you haven't seen the previous video, I'll include a link in the description for you to check it out before or after this one. Today, I'd like to discuss 5 more characters who are viable candidates for a base release roster, or maybe expansion content, plus a few noteworthy characters at the end who should at least be referenced, so stick around for that. Without further ado, I lamented at the end of the previous video that Samira was not able to make the list. Ultimately, I made that decision because there were already a few characters who fulfilled her role and playstyle, and Noxus wasn't really in need of additional representation. I played with the idea of including her as a rep from Shurima instead of Azir, but Azir's playstyle was simply more unique, and given that Samira was an emigrant from Shurima, it seemed a little disingenuous. On top of all of that, Samira is significantly more likely to sell copies as a fan favorite. I wouldn't put it past Riot to use her as bait to buy a DLC pack or pay a little to unlock the character. Samira is Dante. She is straight up Dante as he appears in Marvel vs. Capcom. She's a Noxian agent with a devil-may-care daredevil streak who wields a pair of somewhat anachronistic handguns and a brutal blade. On Summoner's Rift, Samira builds a Dance Dance Revolution-like style meter for landing combos and skill shots. This meter gates her ability to use her ultimate, Inferno Trigger, which is in essence Death Blossom for you recovering Overwatch addicts. The need to maintain her style meter, her dashing engages, and her daredevil personality naturally lend themselves to a persistence rushdown character, with strong mix-ups, easy cross-ups, and rekkas. Like Samira, Wukong is another character I decided to leave out of the first video, in part because of his popularity and likelihood to sell copies. If Riot wants Project L to sell in China, they will include Wukong. Something tells me that the fighting game community is more likely to know about Wukong as a character and about Journey to the West than some other genre communities. But for the uninitiated, Wukong is a folklore hero with more star power than Mickey fucking Mouse. Because of this popularity, why not sell him as a DLC character? Wukong is a staff-wielding Vastayan who is trained to fight smarter, not harder. Student and lifelong friend to Master Yi, he incorporates light-hearted guile and trickery into the Wuju tradition. On Summoner's Rift, he has the ability to create short-lived jutsu puppets of himself, which duplicate his abilities and can briefly distract an opponent. Much like Xayah's Feather Recall, the way I imagine incorporating this ability is just too dope to not include. Depending on player input, Wukong may dash forward through an opponent or send a clone dashing forward through an opponent. It is impossible to know which has been done until after Wukong's next input window, which would be duplicated by the clone, and then the clone would slowly dissipate. This would require an opponent to read the Wukong player well enough to figure out if he's going for a cross-up or if he's just using the clone to create a mix-up opportunity for himself. Some of you were going to riot if I didn't include Zed, and I completely understand why. Yet again, while I was genuinely mulling over whether or not I should really add another Ionian, and if I could reasonably add him without being forced to also add Shen, I decided to leave him out because of his popularity. Zed will sell copies, therefore Riot will sell him as DLC. Also, yet again, the way I envision his playstyle is cool as hell. While his gimmick has substantial overlap with Wukong in theory, there's enough potential here to change its duration and behavior that I find it justifiable. In League of Legends, Zed leaves behind an obviously false shadow clone that responds to his commands, such as throwing a chakram. Unlike Wukong, who uses his clones to confuse an opponent mid-combo, Zeds would behave more like traps and less like puppets, requiring setup and good footsies to use them to their fullest. A good Zed would keep his clone at the ready for a long time, using it to passively create pressure or exploit poor positioning. At the end of a launcher combo, Zed could create an X with thrown chakram at a shallow angle and deliver a huge burst of damage. This next choice hinges on Season 2 of Arcane, because this character is all but confirmed to not only make an appearance, but to have a very important role. I won't go too far into his lore because of this, but Arcane fans who do not know this character may still want to skip to this time if they want absolutely no visual or gameplay related spoilers. Warwick is a biologically tormented beast who was once, as rumor has it, a good man. In League of Legends, he stalks about the space between the combat lanes in wait for an opportunity to burst out and maul a wounded opponent, as the scent of their blood sends him into a fury. In a 2D fighter, Warwick would play like an engage-oriented grappler, leaping a set distance across the screen and grabbing opponents who fail to take away from his landing point. In reference to his Blood Frenzy, Warwick is a good candidate for a win more install to counter tag comps that rely on a lot of switching, improving his frame data and damage in response to both enemy tag team members having below half or so health at the same time. Now, some of you may be thinking, this list sure has a lot of Ionians and Pilties considering one of your goals was regional diversity.
I'll evacuate the customers, you call the
Jargonians.
Hello, operator? Get me the name.
Jargonians.
Hello, you've reached the
Jargonians.
automated phone service.
Squidward!
Ionians.
They're running the name.
Jargonians.
not that!
Jargonians.
I hope to partly alleviate that by including a champion I initially thought I was only wanting to include because of personal bias, but was encouraged by friends to make the inclusion. Pantheon. Our first representative from Targon, Pantheon is actually another good pick for the base game depending on roster choices that might differ from mine. Atreus, as he is named, was known among his people to indeed be fairly skilled, but to be incredibly resilient and win his battles essentially through attrition, outlasting his opponents by sheer mortal will. On a pilgrimage to the peak of Mount Targon, he was rewarded by taking on the mantle of the god of war, Pantheon, who proceeded to completely dominate his mind and take his body on a joyride to kill Darkin. When the aspect of war within him was eventually slain, Atreus survived, and, spiteful of the god who literally stole him, took up the weapons of the aspect in the name of humanity. Pantheon's spear and shield periodically swell with the power of the god who once bore them on Summoner's Rift. Every few attacks, his next ability, whether that be a dive, a thrown spear, or bearing up his shield, has additional effects. For Project L, though, I can't see this being based exclusively on the number of attacks thrown. Instead, I think the empowered ability should be referenced based on the finisher of choice in a Rekka string. A Pantheon player could use fast shield bashes or leaps to reference his W ability to create opportunities to begin these strings, or rely instead on a reversal playstyle to capitalize on the use of his shield. And here we are again. Those 5 characters I see being strong additions to the game, and good candidates knowing the intent and common practice of Riot Games for the first 6 months to a year of DLC releases. We have a total of 30 champions now, which means we have the same number of characters that MVCI had when it came out, so depending on the scope of the game, it's not impossible to see these characters on initial release. As I said a few times though, heavy hitters for Riot's bottom line are likely to be used as a carrot on a stick to unlock DLC content, especially if the game doesn't have prolific skin lines included as cosmetics. With that said, I think it's time to discuss a few honorable mentions who may be popular, but are not likely to make an appearance in my opinion. This one has to be discussed first, as Set is a very common fan pick for Project L. Just like many of you, I can see how he would play, and that his themes make for a strong natural fit with a competitive fighter. But I just don't expect Riot to include him. Set, mechanically, doesn't bring anything to the table that Vi doesn't also bring. Everything from the brawler aesthetic, to the grappler gameplay, to the flying suplexes, Vi just does it too. Seeing Echo's redesign, it's clear to me that Project L is going to lean heavily on the popularity of Arcane rather than the core League of Legends community, and I think that's ultimately how I would do it in their position too. I can see him having a similar, but less aerial playstyle with an install based on damage taken as a best case scenario for him, but I don't see him outselling Vi after the hype of Arcane, and I don't see him as any more popular than other characters I talked about today. Thresh would otherwise be my pick for a Shadow Isles representative, of which we have none so far. I want so badly to include him, but Thresh is a point of fear for Riot's development team. I mentioned Wukong previously as a character that would sell copies regionally, as he's very popular in China. Thresh, in that sense, is an anti-Wukong. I don't pretend to be an expert on Chinese culture, as I am a very white Texan, but it is my understanding that depictions of corpses and skulls make a game very hard to sell in China. If Thresh is included, the design team would have to make a very crucial decision. Does he look like this? Or does he look like this? Next to Seraphine's release, Thresh's Wild Rift design is one of the most controversial champion design decisions made by Riot. I fully expect them to not touch Thresh at all because of this, in an effort to not divide their player base and maintain international sales figures. Teemo stands next to Jinx as one of the most recognizable characters in League of Legends, for those who don't play the game. As I said in the previous video, I don't think it's impossible to include Yordles in Project L. Shorties have their place, and playing fast and loose with their exact scale is completely accepted among League players. That being said, Teemo would be a scourge of the game if he were included as a fighter. Invisibility, traps, damage over time, and poke, all combined on one character, do not make for a very healthy choice for gameplay, even as a meme pick. He's best kept as a character in the background of either a Bandle City stage or a Zaun stage. Aurelion Sol is a character I actually debated including in my initial video, as one of the zonerest zoners to ever zoner, but I ultimately decided that while it was okay to play with the scale of Yordles to make them a fair fight, it didn't feel right to do that with an enormous champion like Aurelion Sol, Galio, and Malphite. All three of them I think would make for excellent stages though, and I can imagine fighting on the slopes of Targon, watching Malphite awaken and begin to move in the background. I can also imagine fighting on the back of Aurelion Sol in front of a moving starscape, watching his face fade in and out of the background as he carries the fighters through the cosmos. Vel'Koz, like Aurelion Sol, was actually pretty high on my list for zoners because his kit would be pretty rad if included. I don't think his floating would need to impact most low attacks, as some of his tentacles could simply wave a bit below him and be an active hurt box. He just couldn't make the cut though, as there were other characters who had gimmicks that were more compelling than his knock-up into Geometry Blast combo. That's it. Those are my 30 picks for the first year or so of Project L's lifetime. There are other characters though that I still want to talk about. I'm considering another video in this same format, showing off just a few DLC picks and discussing honorable mentions yet again, or maybe a video on 3 or 4 pairs of characters, like Xayah and Rakan, who would have natural synergy both in lore and mechanics. Interactions between these characters, and that of, for example, Akali and Zed, I expect to be prolific in the game, and would love to discuss them. Let me know which of these you'd like to see in the comments, and should there be enough demand, I'll begin production soon. If you want to make sure you see that video, be sure to subscribe here. And with that said, be well.